It all began with a single question that no one inside NASCAR dared to voice openly. What happens when a person bypasses the traditional waiting line and still steps straight into the brightest spotlight? That is precisely what unfolded with Cleetus McFarland, known in the garage as Garrett Mitchell. In the beginning, it felt completely harmless, even refreshing and full of energy. A YouTuber entering the world of NASCAR. It came across as an entertaining side tale, something fresh and unique, something the fans might actually get behind and support. He was never meant to rattle the entire foundation, yet matters intensified rapidly. Cleetus did not arrive through the standard route everyone else followed. There was no extended struggle in late models, no countless seasons of short track wars fought under faint lights, no gradual ascent through the levels where every single gain is hard-won and deserved. Instead, he constructed something entirely different: an enormous audience. Millions of viewers followed him as he constructed outrageous cars, tested boundaries, and transformed racing into pure entertainment. He was not merely a driver, he was an entire spectacle, and for some time that approach succeeded. When he initially entered ARCA, the expectations sat extremely low, practically zero. Nobody wondered whether he would claim victory, they simply questioned if he could manage to keep the car on the pavement, and remarkably, he managed it. Not flawlessly, not in a dazzling manner, but sufficiently. Sufficient to complete the races, sufficient to display brief glimpses of ability, sufficient to cause people to stop and consider, perhaps this is not merely a gimmick, perhaps there is actual substance present. But NASCAR does not operate on uncertain possibilities, and that is exactly when the entire dynamic transformed. Because without any warning, Cleetus secured something substantial: a partnership with Richard Childress Racing. And instantly the atmosphere altered completely. This was no longer simply a content creator experimenting with a fresh idea. This had become genuine. Elite-level machinery, authentic demands, authentic strain, and above all else, authentic examination. Because within the garage, other drivers began to take notice and they began raising questions. Not loudly in the open at first, not in a hostile way, just subdued discussions that gradually expanded into something far larger. How did he arrive at this point so quickly? Why was it him specifically? What about the drivers who had invested years chasing that identical opportunity? That was when the initial genuine fractures emerged. Mark Martin became one of the earliest to express it directly. He refused to evade the issue or water it down. He challenged whether qualifying attempts and minimal experience were adequate to warrant competing at that elite level. And he stated unmistakably it was not solely about results on the track, it concerned safety above all, because NASCAR shows no mercy. At circuits like Rockingham, one minor error can escalate into something far more severe. Experience is not merely advantageous in those conditions, it is essential, and Cleetus possessed very little of it. Then additional voices joined in, bringing even more worry. Kyle Busch entered the discussion and highlighted something that struck with greater force. Young drivers, those who have pursued this ambition their whole lives, typically accumulate far more time behind the wheel long before they reach this point. Far more. And yet here stood Cleetus, already receiving chances those others had never even approached. It was not fury, it was something more detached, pure skepticism. Because the established system had always remained straightforward. You demonstrate your worth, you advance steadily, you deserve every step. But Cleetus bypassed that entire journey. He chose an alternate route and now he stood right there. Even the drivers attempting to remain impartial could not overlook it. Brad Keselowski recognized the practical side. Yes, from a business standpoint it was logical. Cleetus delivered visibility, supporters, attention. But that fact did not eliminate the larger issue. What about the proper approval standards? Because this was not purely entertainment, it involved high-velocity racing, genuine outcomes, genuine peril, and that is where the whole scenario began to feel uneasy. Because from NASCAR's perspective, Cleetus held real worth, substantial worth. Every occasion he competed, audiences tuned in. Fans who had never shown interest in NASCAR suddenly began watching. Social platforms ignited, interaction soared. That level of exposure could not be dismissed. But inside the garage, that same worth generated friction. Because certain drivers started to sense that something fundamental was shifting, that perhaps NASCAR was no longer focused exclusively on the most skilled drivers. Perhaps it was also about whoever could generate the greatest attention. And if that held true, then what would become of the system they had relied upon for so long? That question lingered heavily. And then Daytona arrived. His Truck Series debut, the occasion when everything might have begun quieting the criticism. Instead, it achieved the exact opposite: a collision. It occurred early, swiftly, and harshly in everything it symbolized. Because it did not merely conclude his event, it handed the doubters precisely what they had been anticipating: evidence. Proof that perhaps he was not prepared, proof that perhaps the worries were not merely personal views. Because in NASCAR, initial impressions carry weight and unfavorable ones linger. They trail behind you, they expand. Abruptly, the discussion moved away from promise and toward danger, toward whether placing him in that role had been the correct decision whatsoever. And just like that, the narrative reversed. From intrigue to dispute, from enthusiasm to separation. But here is where matters grew truly captivating, because rather than retreating, Cleetus pushed forward even more intensely than earlier. While the garage continued conversing, while supporters debated, while skeptics piled on their reservations, he returned to grinding, testing, completing laps, analyzing every error, investing extended hours at Rockingham, driving himself harder than anyone had anticipated. No cameras required, no grand declarations, simply dedication, silent and unyielding. And amid one of those lengthy sessions, something occurred, something modest yet significant. The type of instance that appears insignificant initially until you grasp its true importance. It did not resemble a major headline at first. No collision, no flames, no disorder, merely a car beginning to lose grip, partway through an extended run at Rockingham on tires that had lost their edge, the kind that punish any slip the back end broke free. It was not a mild slide, not something simple to recover. This represented the sort of instant that ruins entire days. The angle worsened. The car commenced spinning, and for a brief moment it appeared identical to Daytona once more. Another loss of command, another justification for everyone to declare he was far beyond his capabilities. But then, everything altered. No alarm, no abrupt yank on the steering, merely an adjustment, fluid, composed, exact. He regained control, maintained it, rescued the situation, and continued onward. That was all. No cheering, no intense call over the radio, simply a subdued moment where catastrophe was avoided. But when the footage reached the internet, the entire perspective changed. Because suddenly viewers were no longer witnessing a YouTuber struggling to endure, they were witnessing a driver developing. And that is where the division deepened. Once again, certain fans embraced it without hesitation. They recognized advancement, genuine advancement, the type that arises only from dedicated effort. Countless hours on the circuit, errors converted into knowledge. To them this served as confirmation. Confirmation that Cleetus was not present merely for notice, he was progressing, deserving it step by step. But others refused to budge, not even slightly. Because to them, a single recovery fails to rewrite the narrative, steadiness does. And Cleetus had not demonstrated that yet, not during actual races, not when the stakes were highest. And that lies at the core of this whole circumstance. Two entirely contrasting interpretations of the identical instant, advancement, or mere appearance. And directly amid that separation, Cleetus persisted onward. Because here is what most individuals fail to observe. While the arguments continue across the internet, while drivers offer remarks, while fans choose positions, he remains laboring, remains competing, remains pursuing something that arrives with difficulty, experience. And he is pursuing it in a manner completely distinct from all the others. Owning the Freedom Factory allows him to avoid waiting for opportunities behind the wheel, and he generates them whether day or night, lap following lap, repetition without boundaries. That represents an edge, and a substantial one. And because in racing, sensation matters above everything, and sensation arrives solely through time. But even that edge possesses its limit. Because regardless of how many laps you complete in solitude, it differs entirely from actual race conditions. It differs from battling traffic, from pressure, from instant choices with vehicles surrounding you on every side. And that is precisely where all attention is focused at present, the upcoming race. Because whether individuals confess it or not, this represents the decisive point. Not formally, not on any record, but emotionally, for the supporters, for the drivers, for the complete discussion revolving around him, this serves as the examination. If he heads out there and maintains cleanliness, if he competes intelligently, avoids complications, displays command throughout an entire event instead of only brief moments, then something transforms. The criticism does not vanish, but it diminishes, the inquiries evolve. And for the first occasion, people might begin to declare, very well, perhaps he does belong in this arena. But if events unfold differently, if another error surfaces, another collision, another instant that reinforces the existing narrative, then everything intensifies, grows stricter, becomes more fractured. Because the reality is, Cleetus is not evaluated in the manner of an ordinary driver. He cannot be. An ordinary newcomer receives time, space to develop, room to make errors without fanfare. Cleetus lacks that luxury. Every error is magnified, every achievement is scrutinized, every single moment is observed closely, and that strain remains unrelenting. But here is the unexpected element that nobody can disregard any longer. He has already altered something, whether people accept it or not. Because at this moment drivers are discussing him, fans are debating him, the focus remains fixed upon him, and that does not occur without reason. That occurs when an individual disturbs the established order, when they compel a sport to examine itself and confront difficult inquiries. What carries greater weight, the journey or the outcome, heritage or advancement? Because Cleetus McFarland embodies both aspects simultaneously. He is the newcomer who bypassed stages and the competitor striving to demonstrate he can still master them. And that internal conflict, that is what renders this tale impossible to overlook, because we have witnessed similar situations in different shapes previously. Individuals dismissed, individuals distrusted, individuals informed they had no place, and occasionally they prove every skeptic incorrect. But occasionally they fail to do so. And right now, nobody can predict which direction this will take. Not the fans, not the drivers, perhaps not even Cleetus himself. All we understand is this. The next occasion he buckles into that vehicle, it will not represent merely another competition, it will serve as a declaration in one direction or the other. Because ultimately, there exists no concealment in NASCAR, no easy paths once the green flag falls, only velocity, ability, and reality. So the inquiry is not whether Cleetus McFarland reached this point through a different method, that portion has already been recorded. The genuine inquiry is what unfolds next. Does he rise up to embrace the challenge, or does he become the cautionary tale everyone had cautioned about?